Hello and welcome to another edition of Money, Me and COVID-19, where we talk to opinion leaders to find out their take on what's going on at the moment and how we as investors can respond to it. Now, I'm sure my guest today won't mind being talked of as a heavyweight in the property sector. He's been around it for some decades now. He's been involved in some enormous projects like Canary Wharf, been an advisor to the government and the Bank of England. He's a Justice of the Peace and a Freeman of the City of London. And his name is Stephen Galpin. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hello, Graham. Good to see you.
I know as a Freeman, you do have the right to herd your cattle across the bridges of London. I hope you're not going to get involved in that for the next little while we talk to you.
Actually, it's only the sheep.
Oh, okay. Well, if you could just keep them in the background for now, that'd be great.
I will try. Okay.
Now, Stephen, as you know, a lot of people talk about the property market as if it was a single entity, and we both know there are hundreds of property markets. So let me try and get specific with you on certain sectors, because obviously there's so much going on at the moment. It's quite hard to see the wood for the trees. So if we take, let's say, the commercial sector, let's start off with perhaps a sector that was already somewhat in trouble before COVID-19, and that's the retail sector. What's your take on what we're going to see on the high streets of the country in the coming months?
Well, I think you've already seen over the last 2 or 3 years that the high street's in trouble. We've seen a change of attitude towards high streets. A lot of people putting a lot of time, a lot of effort into trying to refocus the high street, maybe into a greater mix of residential and various different types of services, some entertainment, some food, some retail, rather than this just strip of, highly priced shops, the majority owned by some of the institutional investors who simply look for the highest rent for the longest period of time. I think that kind of ethos now has to finish. I think that was resultant of the various commissions that have been sought over the last few years to try and regenerate the high streets, but even more so now. I just don't think it can ever return quite to what it was.
I guess we're seeing this almost conflict going on now between the businesses in the high street and the landlords, who sometimes are not that receptive to the idea of being a bit more realistic about rents or rent holidays. I mean, how do you see this ending in terms of this?
Well, I mean, I have to say, just on a slightly humorous note, I mean, I know some years ago I had to act for one of the private banks who had encouraged a fairly small firm to go into a fairly large premises, and I ended up talking to one of the chairmen of one of these institutional companies, and I said, you have totally inappropriate tenant paying a totally inappropriate rent in a totally inappropriate building. And he just looked at me and he said, well, yes, he said, my books are full of such people. That's how we make our money. And I thought, whoops, I'm not quite sure where we go with this one, but we did negotiate a way out of it. But I think that's been the attitude of the institutional investors for a long time. They've wanted blue chip covenants, they've wanted high rents, and they've wanted long leases. That is going to have to change. We need to rekindle this entrepreneurial spirit amongst our smaller traders, our smaller companies, and give people opportunities. And restriction on high street governments isn't going to do that. We need to free up, and this is why I think you'll see the breakdown. We saw it some years ago. I don't know whether you know the Whiteley's building in West 2. It was one sort of super shop at one time. I think it was owned by Selfridges, if my memory serves me correctly, but it got broken up into various smaller units and sort of sectioned off into various trades and food halls and things. And it worked very well for quite a number of years. And I think that's maybe what we have to see again. If we don't, I can just see an awful lot of empty shops and sitting there empty for a long, long time.
Okay, and I think obviously I think most of us were kind of aware of the challenges in the retail sector. But what's really happened with COVID-19 is this enforced working from home and the use of technology like Zoom, as we are using today. Surely that's going to start making companies think, do I really need to spend so much on this great big fancy office building that brings everyone together? Why don't we just have a small head office and everyone work from home?
Well, once again, I mean, somebody said to me once about the costs of London lawyers. You know, you've only got to look at some of the offices with swimming pools, five-star chefs cooking the lunches and things like this, and even some of the banks with their own in-house hairdressers, gyms, and all. And of course, all this has to be paid for by the end user at the end of the day. But over the last, again, 4 or 5 years, maybe a little bit longer even, we've seen even some of the top firms have their partners working from home or from serviced offices in their hometown or whatever. And that's been a growing market. And I can only see that this crisis is going to push people further down that road. I mean, yes, maybe you do need to take serviced offices with boardrooms and meeting rooms that are available to you as and when you require. But is there this need now for these huge posh offices with huge facilities? I just don't know. I personally don't think so. I think we're going to have a change.
And of course, I think people may be sitting there watching us thinking, well, you know, why should that concern me? These are big institutions. But of course, the reality is a lot of people's pension funds, a lot of people's property, real estate investment trusts have their assets tied up in these kind of buildings.
Well, they do indeed, but I think you've probably seen the press this week. People are coming out of property bonds, they're coming out of property investments. I actually think they'll probably be rushing in like there's no tomorrow very, very shortly in a few months' time, thinking there's a lot of bargains around. But yes, I think the whole climate is changing, and I'm not sure that this move that we've had since the crash into sort of big institutions controlling everything was the right way to go, and I think it's being reversed now. I think we're certainly seeing a change.
Okay, well let's talk about the other major side of property. Obviously, is the residential market, and again, there are hundreds across the country. If we start with London itself, I think you've got some pretty strong views about some of the changes recently having quite a big impact on the London residential market.
Well, look, Graham, I mean, I don't think it takes a clever person to realise that we have these recessions in property every perhaps 10 or 15 years. They seem to come round every time. It's all horror stories everywhere. And let's just go back to our most recent one in 2008. We suffered a lot of consequences from that. I believe that, yes, Mr. Carney and the Bank of England certainly encouraged the banks to have stronger balance sheets after that episode. But actually, it's almost been done at the price to our young people. Big deposits, which they can't afford, higher interest rates. And when I say higher interest rates, I mean perhaps larger margins from base rate to mortgage rate. It's not been helpful to our housing market, because I think one of the failings of government has been to realise that whatever section, whatever part of the housing market you freeze, penalise or hurt, it actually has a spread right across the board, from first timers to last timers. It happens every time, and the government just don't seem to want to learn this lesson. Now, without being critical of any particular individual or political party or any body, Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors will tend to give advice to the government, but their perspective is very much about property values and how they're arrived at and on what basis they're set. Our government ministers, well, you know, we heard from our last one, he was going to go out into the market and get to the grassroots of what's happening and how it works and all the rest of it. Well, I'm not sure that somebody with 2 homes in London, another second home, and then a constituency 3rd home, I'm not quite sure how grounded that particular person is. Now, that's not a criticism, but I just wonder what his knowledge of the first-time buyer and the sensitivities of that market are. So we need to get a better way of putting information together. We need to have a better understanding. Now, going back to 2008, we collapsed here because of the subprime market deficiencies. That caused us a lot of problem. As I said earlier, it took 4 or 5 years for us to get over that. And By today's standards, I think that's going to be shown as a pretty modest recession. I think we're in for a really bad time here. Now, why? Let's take London. We've had a transitional change over the last 15 years or so from relatively low-rise buildings to now buildings. I'm just looking out my window here at Canary Wharf. I'm looking at one just opposite me, 70 stories, best part of 1,000 apartments in one building. Now, I'll have a wager with you that probably 70% of those have been bought off plan by overseas buyers. Okay, now, does that matter? No, I'm not somebody who would demonize that process or that kind of investment. Any investment in our country coming from abroad or anywhere else has to be welcome, and it's a compliment that people have so much respect for our property regulations, our laws, and our safety. That's great news. But I just wonder whether it could be on the cards that we have exchange controls again, like you and I might remember from the 70s when I think you could only take 25 quid on holiday, never mind about investing overseas property. I think governments here, we're faced with the choice of getting out of this recession or whatever it's going to be called by either borrowing money, printing money, or huge investment. Now, if the governments are going to say, let's have investment in our own country, I can quite see that there may be restrictions on wanting to invest abroad, especially in speculative things like housing in a country other than your own. So I wonder, all these people, for instance, say looking across the road, who've bought maybe 500-600 apartments, 10% down, I wonder how keen they're going to be to complete in 6 or 8 months' time, because this is the problem we had in 2008. Now, people like me get very busy in that sort of scenario because we're asked to advise, how do we remarket, how do we do this, how do we do that? But this is going to be a huge collapse because the height of the buildings today that have been given planning permission and the volume in any one building is so high that, I mean, a building, say like I'm looking at, is probably heading towards £1 billion in total gross development value. Now, if that developer takes a hit of almost £1 billion, that's almost unrecoverable from the banks. It's not something you can quickly work your way out of. The remarketing would take 2 or 3 years. So it's going to cause a huge, huge problem. Now, I don't know quite how we're going to solve that. Whether it be the government say, well, okay, let's regenerate the market. Let's have stamp duty holidays. We have, as a plus side, got absolutely the lowest interest rates I've ever known or seen. I mean, I go back, just trying to think how many years, 30 years. I remember sitting in an office listening to interest rates going up sort of 0.5% every half an hour until they got to about 15%. I think that was about 1989, wasn't it, if I remember rightly? Yeah. You know, that was shocking, but we're at less than 1% at the moment. Now, what I'd like to see is the government taking these restrictions off purchase, taking these implied restrictions on deposits, but also maybe at the same time as a safety level, insisting that the banks are capped in what they can charge. Now, I mean, you will remember, Graham, that perhaps for business purposes, you want to borrow money. Well, if you're a blue chip client, you'd pay 1 over base, and if you're a bit dodgy, you'd pay 2% over base, you know, if it was a bit more entrepreneurial. So I think something like a 2% over base cap on what the banks could charge, that in itself could do a tremendous amount for the market and stimulate it. Now, you'll know, if you ever watch me on property TV or anything, you'll know that they all take the mickey and say I'm too London-centric and I'm too focused on London. Well, the reason I focused on London is because that is where these things happen in volume, and then it tends to spread out to the rest of the country. So it's very important to look at what's happening here.
So what, you know, obviously you're painting a relatively, you know, gloomy scenario there. What if I had to sort of, you know, nail it to the wall, what would you say is going to happen to prices in the residential property market when we come out of this lockdown phase?
Well, I think there's 2 factors there. One is what are the prices going to be? Is there going to be just a sort of blanket percentage drop? And a lot of the valuers are telling me that they're looking at a 30 to 40% drop in values. Now, it does worry me that I've spent almost a lifetime battling with valuers over property values at developments that I've been involved with. And of course, I'm not sure the public always realise, but a valuer always tends to be a little bit pessimistic because they have something called liability insurance. So what that means is if they accidentally overvalue or show any negligence in doing so, the lender who relies on that value can sue them. And so you do get a strain of valuers who tend to be, let's just be polite, overly cautious when they value. Now, they are going to be the key to what happens, because at the end of the day, it's not what you or I agree to buy or sell a property at, it's what we can get it valued at and how much we can borrow on it. And that brings me to the real key, which will be, it'll be borrowing that takes us out of this problem. If we free up borrowing, we get activity in the market, if we make our purchases fundable, then we'll do okay. So that will then quickly take us out of this initial drop, this initial scare, and get us on the market to an upward, all right, I accept inflationary sort of market, but that's how everybody's enjoyed property in this country for many, many years. It's called inflation.
Okay. Let's talk about a particular sector of the residential market. We have something like 2 million buy-to-let landlords in this country. They've already had a succession of measures going all the way back to good old George Osborne and his Section 24. Now, suddenly, I read recently that in the month of March, only 44% of rent was actually paid in full and on time. So, you know, this is obviously a really challenging time to be a buy-to-let landlord. What are your thoughts on the impact on that?
Well, I think, again, we'd have to look at where the buy-to-let landlords come from. We've got our home investors and we've got our overseas investors. I see a problem for overseas investors because they are going to want to see property not directly in their control, let quickly, and those returns being shipped out of the country. Now, that's going to be difficult because that's going to cause a problem for values in this country. And in the recession that we had, I think from memory it was late 80s, we had a situation where people, this was before buy-to-let had really caught on, but we had a situation where banks were saying, hold on, we've lent you X amount on these rental properties. Lovely, you've got your rent coming in. But we've looked at the value of the market at the moment. It's dropped by 20, 25%. So unfortunately, you're going to have to put some more equity in for us to continue the lending. Now, I would hate for that to happen again, but I can see it coming. I mean, we've had direction. We've had direction from the banks, from the government to the banks over this business interruption scheme. I can tell you now, one particular bank that we deal with us told us that if we wanted a business interruption scheme, we'd have to guarantee it personally as directors. We'd have to put housing up to go with it. It would be at a certain interest rate, and our guarantees would be for 100% of the money. Now, when you say, well, okay, sorry, where does the government 80% guarantee come in? Where does it come in and where does it stop? They say, well, that's your problem, not ours. You know, we want to know you fit the criteria. So you've got banks who are very keen to be helped in the 2008 scenario, not so keen when it comes to putting something back. They still want to put in control their own criteria for lending. And to some extent, they've got shareholders to protect and they've got to take a responsible view, but they have got to toe the line. And the same thing is going to happen in the housing market if that's where they want to be. Again, Graham, you and I will remember at one time, very, very rare you would borrow money for a house from a bank. It would always be a building society, a special lender. And ever since it's gone over to the banking side to take the lion's share of lending, the market has become unstable at certain times because you're subject to the bank's whim about what they think about the housing market at any one time. And again, I'm very keen to avoid that. Now, that's the one area that I think will affect badly the buy-to-let market. And I also think that it'll be the first to suffer in terms of looking for new funding, because I think what the banks will say, we've expended so much money on these government schemes, on staying solvent ourselves and all the rest of it, we're not going to be lending money for speculative ventures or investments. We need to concentrate on providing homes for people. In other words, a real market. So again, coming back to one of my earlier points, for all this borrowing that's got to take place to take us out of these scenarios, somebody's got to have the money to lend, and I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Okay, so I think one of the hardest things that I'm seeing to try and predict is where we are on this kind of tug of war between deflation and inflation, because obviously a lot of what you've described in terms of prices going down and so on is deflationary, but then we talk about, you know, money printing and all the rest of it potentially being inflation. So where do you see that kind of deflation versus inflation going in the coming months?
Well, I recently did a very short paper on what I thought the prospects for this market were in the sort of fairly short term. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, you know, interest rates are at 0.1%. We shouldn't lose sight of that. And that's a very, I mean, for somebody who's been in the property market for many, many years, that's a very exciting prospect. The only trouble it's going to be is getting your hands on it. Now, if we can get our hands on money at low rates, I mean, let me just quickly revert back to, again, 2008. One of the consequences for developers was you'd go along to one of our big high street banks that were so keen to get into housing. They say, well, I want to do this development. It's 300, 400, 500 million pounds to build and to construct. And the first thing that they'd say is, well, it's a bit strong for us, a bit strong for our balance sheet. So I think you better syndicate it, right? So you go trekking around the banks. Yes, you'd probably get 4 or 5 banks to come in and do it. And if you've ever been in the position that I've been in with some of these developers, where you make a sale, you know, and you've got to get 5 sets of consent from the banks for that sale to go through. You say, well, look, we were asking £500,000, we've got £500,000, can we sell it? And they say, well, you know, you got that quite quickly. So if you can get it that quickly, maybe you could get 550 there. And the answer from one of them will be no, which sort of, you know, it's quite a sort of fractious journey, really. So again, I would hate to see banks syndicating again. Banks have got to have the money to lend, and they've got to have the will to lend. And if they don't, we're going to be in real trouble. Now, if they do, if they can find this money, then actually, if you look at the market, there'll be product available, there'll be cheap money available, and there will certainly, because we've been through quite a flat spot for the last 2 or 3 years, there'll certainly be a pent-up demand to want to buy that product. Now, actually, with those 3 key factors in place, we could almost have a boom. So there you are. That's put you in a quandary. We've gone from total depression to a boom. But I think, you know, I think that's the volatility of the situation. Okay.
Now, I mean, one job in which over the last decade it would have been very hard to get a mortgage would be that of housing minister, because they've averaged, I think, less than a year per person. But if I was to make you the next housing minister, Stephen Galpin, what would you be doing in your first 100 days in office to turn this whole thing around?
Well, I think one thing I would do is refuse to appear on television with my hard hat and my yellow jacket saying we're going to build 200 or 300,000 houses. Whenever this has happened, and I suppose it started with George and Dave, whenever this happens, I want to say, who's we? Who's going to build? Now, look, I can think of one particular company in sort of north end of London that used to specialise in starter homes. Fabulous. They were very square, very straightforward, architecturally uninspiring, but very functional, very fundable, and very affordable. Okay, and they used to do particularly well, but we seem to have come away from that demanding super architectural features, green features. Our current housing minister said he was going to legislate and insist that fruit trees were put in back gardens and things like that. Well, you know, that's really going to change the market, isn't it? That's really going to solve all the problems, having an orange tree or an apple tree in your back garden. We've got to get real about this. We've got to provide what's needed and what is possible for people to buy. And until we grasp that fact, we're going nowhere. If you take stamp duty now, I've been trying to persuade people for years now to put stamp duty as a tax on the seller, not the buyer. Why? Well, one, because when somebody sells a property, unless we're in a particular recession, they're usually making a profit. So that small taxation, it is fairly small on normal housing, can be paid by the seller at the point of sale, doesn't have to become a factive argument as to whether you can fund it or not if you're buying, or extra cash that you've got to find for a deposit for young people. So that would help tremendously. You must remember now, if we're looking at getting foreign investment into the housing market to keep our construction industry going, then again, stamp duty under current legislation is going to get to almost 20% for a lot of this investment property. It's too much. It's too much. And we've just, well, you asked what I would do. I would just make the path to purchase so much easier. It wasn't our kids' fault in 2008 having too big a mortgages. At that time, 100% mortgages were quite often the case in first-time buying and did little or no harm. Do you think that just because somebody has got a 100% mortgage, they're keen to throw away their home by not paying? Of course they're not. Their home is their castle. It's what they want. It was the American situation of selling these mortgages that caused the problem. It wasn't us, it wasn't our kids, but it's those kids that have actually been penalised for what happened there. So we need to open it up, and that's what I'd do if I was housing minister. But I have to say, Graham, I think the chances of that are pretty slim.
Okay, well, you get my vote, Stephen. That's great advice to end on. Stephen Galpin, thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure.